The humidity in the Combat Information Center of the USS Halsey was not a product of the climate control system, which hummed with a desperate, mechanical fervor against the tropical heat of the South China Sea, but rather a manifestation of the collective anxiety radiating from 30 sailors huddled in the blue-lit dark. Commander Elias Thorne stood behind the tactical action officer, his eyes fixed on the large situation display that dominated the forward bulkhead, a digital tapestry of doom that showed his solitary Arleigh-Burke-class destroyer surrounded by a constellation of hostile red icons. They were outnumbered 5-1, a tactical disadvantage that had moved past the point of bravery and settled firmly into the realm of the suicidal. The voice of the Chinese admiral, broadcast over the bridge-to radio channel 16, had ceased its blustering demands for immediate course reversal, had been replaced by a heavy, static-filled silence that felt significantly more dangerous than the threats. Thorne watched the track of a Type 045 Renhai-class cruiser, the Nanchang, as it cut a sharp, predatory arc across the Halsey's bow, violating the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea with a flagrant arrogance that signaled their intent was no longer to escort but to engage. The red line had been drawn at the second Thomas Shoal, a submerged reef that had become the fulcrum of 21st century geopolitics, and Thorne knew with a sickening clarity that he was about to be the man who watched the world trip over it. Across the water, on the bridge of the Nanchang, Admiral Zhao Wei smoothed the front of his pristine white uniform, his gaze locked on the distant, gray silhouette of the American warship through the high-powered optical sights of the bridge wing. He felt a profound sense of historical inevitability, a weight that was both burden and glory, as he contemplated the order he was about to give. For decades, his nation had suffered the indignity of containment, the chafing presence of foreign hulls in waters that he believed belonged to the Middle Kingdom by ancestral right and strategic necessity. Today, the Politburo had authorized a forceful correction of the status quo, a phrase that sanitized the violence Zhao was prepared to unleash. He did not hate the American commander across the water. In fact, he respected the stubbornness of the Halsey's refusal to yield. Respect would not stop the anti-ship cruise missiles resting in his vertical launch cells. He turned to his executive officer, a man whose face was a mask of professional detachment, and gave a nod that was barely a tremor, a signal to illuminate the American ship with fire control radar, the electronic equivalent of cocking a pistol against a man's temple. The bridge of the Nanchang filled with the sharp, chirping tone of the lock confirmation, a sound that Zhao knew was echoing in the ears of his American counterpart as the death knell of peace in the Pacific. Inside the Halsey, the electronic warfare console screamed a warning that cut through the low murmur of the CIC like a physical blow. The SFU-32-2 system identifying the specific high-frequency radar energy of a Type 346B Dragon-I radar onto their hull. Vampire inbound! Vampire inbound! The shout came from the weapons officer, though no missile had yet left the rail, the terminology anticipating the inevitable. Thorne's knuckles turned white as he gripped the back of the TAO's chair, his mind racing through the limited playbook of a single destroyer facing a task force. He could launch his harpoons, empty his VLS cells in a blaze of defiance that might scratch the paint of the Chinese armada, or he could hold fire and pray that this was just another game of brinksmanship gone too far. But the lock was steady, unblinking, a hard radiation stare that stripped away the pretense of a training exercise. "Captain," the TAO said, his voice cracking slightly before he swallowed and found his bearing, "they have a firing solution. We are painted. Countermeasures are on standby, but at this range..." He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't have to. At this range, with that many shooters, the Halsey was a dead ship walking. Thorne keyed the handset for the WMC, his voice echoing through the steel corridors of his vessel, telling his crew to brace for shock, a command that felt pitifully inadequate against the megatonnage of high explosives pointed at them. He thought of his daughter in San Diego, a fleeting image of her riding a bicycle with training wheels, before he shoved the memory into a mental lockbox to make room for the cold calculus of war. The ocean surface was calm, a deceptive mirror that reflected the cumulus clouds gathering on the horizon, indifferent to the escalating pulse of human aggression. Then, the first missile launched from the Nanchang, a streak of white smoke and fire that shattered the tropical afternoon, not aimed directly at the Halsey, but at the Philippine resupply vessel the American destroyer was shielding. The intent was clear: punish the ally to break the protector. Thorne watched the track separate from the Chinese cruiser, accelerating to supersonic in seconds, a kinetic hammer blow aimed at a wooden fishing converted for logistics. "Engage," Thorne barked, the order passing his conscious thought, a reflex honed by 20 years of drills. The Halsey shuddered as a Standard Missile 2 roared out of its forward vertical launch system, the booster casting a blinding glare across the bridge windows. The interceptor climbed, turned, and dove, a thematical miracle of guidance and propulsion that met the Chinese miss 3 miles out in a blooming cloud of shrapnel and fire. The explosion was as a thunderclap that rolled across the water, signaling that the threshold had been crossed. The Nanchang did not hesitate. Having baited the American into firing the first defensive shot, the entire Chinese task force lit up their radars, the sky filling with the electronic noise of a fleet preparing to erase a single target. Thorne realized with a sinking heart that he had fallen into the trap, providing the justification for a crushing retaliatory strike. But as the Chinese fleet prepared to unleash a saturation attack that would overwhelm the Halsey's Aegis combat system, a strange anomaly appeared on the sonar screens of combatants, a ghost in the machine that defied the physics of the engagement. It wasn't a sound exactly, but a displacement, a massive volume of water, being by something that registered on the sensors as no larger than a fishing trawler, yet moved with the relentless momentum of a leviathan. Contact, bearing 270, range. God, range is 0, the sonar supervisor on the Halsey yelled, ripping his headphones off as a high-pitched transient spike shrieked through the system. Out of the haze to the west, where the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, a shape emerged that looked less like a ship and more like a knife carved from obsidian. The USS Zumwalt, DDG-1000, broke the surface of the electronic noise, her tumble-home hull shedding radar waves like water, her angular, pyramid-like superstructure reflecting nothing but the empty sky. She had been there for hours, running silent on her electric drive, a hole in the world that the Chinese raced over and ignored as sea clutter. She was not alone. Flanking her, rising from the swells like a twin shadow, was the USS Michael Mansour, the second of the Ghost Fleet, their bows cutting the water with barely awake. Admiral Zhao stared at the optical feed, his brain struggling to process the sudden appearance of the two vessels. He knew of the Zumwalt class, of course, every naval officer did, but he had dismissed them as failed experiments, expensive technological dead ends with broken guns and no mission. Intelligence reports had placed them in San Diego or undergoing refits in Pascagoula. Not here, not in the middle of his kill box. Identify. He snapped at his bridge crew, but the sensors refused to cooperate. The radar cross-section of the massive destroyers was so small that the fire control computers kept dropping the track, treating the 15,000-ton warships as if they were drifting debris or large waves. It was a technological invisibility cloak, and for the first time since the standoff began, Zhao felt a flicker of doubt. The Zumwalt did not hail them on Channel 16. It did not broadcast a warning. Instead, the lead ship's bow opened, the heavy panels of the modified vertical launch system retracting to reveal the silos that had replaced the useless gun turrets. These were not the standard cells found on the Halsey. These were larger, wider, designed to house a weapon that had, until recently, been a theoretical nightmare for the People's Liberation Army Navy. On the bridge of the Zumwalt, Captain Sarah Vance watched the tactical display with the calm detachment of a predator who has successfully stalked its prey. The air on the bridge was cooler, quieter than on the Halsey, the hum of the integrated power system, a subsonic vibration that felt like the ship was a living holding its breath. Target designator Alpha 1, the Nanchang, Vance said, her voice soft, conversational. Solution set for conventional strike, kinetic only. We're not sinking her today, we're just taking away her eyes. The modifications to the Zumwalt had been extensive, secretive, stripping out the failed advanced gun systems to install the Navy's new hypersonic glide vehicles. These weapons didn't need warheads to destroy a ship. Moving at Mach 5, the energy of the impact alone was enough to vaporize steel and electronics. Birds tight, Vance ordered. Match bearings. Wait for them to blink. She knew the Chinese admiral was paralyzed by the sudden change in variables. The Zumwalt and the Mansour were sitting in his blind spot, their stealth allowing them to close to a range where their hypersonics would impact seconds after launch, leaving no time for the Chinese point defense systems to react. The standoff stretched into minutes that felt like hours, the sun dipping lower, casting long, blood-red shadows across the swells. Admiral Zhao was sweating now, the condensation on his brow a betrayal of his stoic mask. His radar operators were screaming that they couldn't get a lock, that the American ghosts were jamming them, or simply not there, despite the visual evidence to the contrary. If he fired on the Halsey, the Zumwalt would fire on him, and at this range, his flagship would be a burning hulk before his missiles cleared their tubes. He had crossed the red line expecting a localized skirmish, a bullying match he was guaranteed to win, but the board had been flipped. The Americans had brought a queen to a pawn fight. Signal the fleet, Zhao said, his voice tight, the words tasting like ash. Come to heading 090. Disengage locks. He watched the Zumwalt through his binoculars, the dark monolith sitting motionless on the water, its very presence a silent rebuke. It was a psychological checkmate. The American stealth destroyers hadn't fired a shot, but they had demonstrated a capability that rendered his numerical superiority irrelevant. If they could get this close undetected, they could be anywhere. The ocean, once a Chinese lake in his mind, had suddenly become a dark room filled with invisible knives. Captain Thorne on the Halsey let out a breath he felt he had been holding for a lifetime as the red icons on his screen turned from hostile to neutral, the Chinese task force beginning a slow, sullen turn to the east. They're backing down, the TO whispered, disbelief coloring his tone. Thorne looked out the port bridge wing at the Zumwalt, now visible as a dark geometric shape against the twilight, looked alien, unnatural, a ship from a future war that had somehow arrived in the present one. The radio crackled, and for the first time, the stealth ship spoke. USS Halsey, this is Zumwalt. We have the watch. You are clear to proceed to Rendezvous Point Bravo. We'll cover your 6. The voice was distorted, metallic, lacking the human warmth of typical comms, adding to the vessel. Thorne picked up the handset. That Zumwalt. Good to see you. Halsey out. He replaced the receiver with a trembling hand, the adrenaline crash hitting him all at once. He looked around his bridge at the young faces of his crew, faces that would continue to age, to live, because of the 2 ghosts floating in the twilight. As the Halsey limped away, her engines throbbing with a reassuring rhythm, the Zumwalt and the Mansour lingered, watching the Chinese fleet retreat over the horizon. Inside the CIC of the Zumwalt, the tension had not fully dissipated. Captain Vance knew that this was not a victory, but a postponement. The red line had been crossed, and though they had pushed the enemy back this time, the secret of their capabilities was out. The Chinese would adapt. They would develop new sensors, new tactics to hunt the hunters. But for tonight, under the canopy of stars appearing in the deepening violet sky, the ocean belonged to the silent service. Vance ordered the ship to return to stealth condition, the VLS doors closing with a hydraulic hiss, sealing the hypersonic monsters back into their darkness. Helm, bring us to course 180, she commanded. Let's fade away. The great electric engines hummed, the tumblehome bow sliced the water without a splash, and the USS Zumwalt in the night, a guardian demon patrolling the fragile edge of peace. The silence that followed on the Halsey was filled with the mundane sounds of a standing down from general quarters, the clatter of helmets being stowed, the rustle of life jackets being removed, the exhale of a crew realizing they were not going to die. Thorne retreated to his sea cabin, his hands shaking as he poured a cup of lukewarm coffee. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the bulkhead, replaying the tactical encounter in his mind, the speed of the engagement, the helplessness of his position, the sudden, godlike intervention of the stealth destroyers. It was a paradigm shift in naval warfare that he was still struggling to comprehend. He realized that the era of the surface combatant as a visible, imposing show of force was ending. The future belonged to the invisible, to the ships that could strike without warning and vanish without a trace. He thought of the Nanchang, a beautiful, powerful ship that had been rendered obsolete in a matter of seconds by the mere threat of the unseen. The red line had been crossed, yes, but the U.S. Navy had shown that they could redraw it anywhere, anytime, invisible ink. Miles away, aboard the Nanchang, the mood was somber, a funeral wake for lost pride. Admiral Zhao sat in his private quarters, the lights dimmed, a glass of baijiu untouched on his desk. He was writing a report to the Central Military Commission, struggling to find the words to explain how a superior force had been routed without a shot being exchanged. How could he describe the feeling of being watched by a ghost? How could he quantify the terror of a weapon system that you couldn't see until it was too late? He realized that his career might be over, a casualty of this bloodless skirmish, but more importantly, he understood that his country's strategic calculus had been fundamentally flawed. They had built a navy to fight the last war, a navy of big ships and big missiles, while the Americans had been quietly building the navy of the next war. He deleted the first paragraph of his report and started again, typing a single sentence. We must learn to see in the dark. The Zumwalt through the thermoclines of the South China Sea, her acoustic signature masked by the noise of the ambient ocean. Below decks, the crew moved with the hushed efficiency of submariners, conscious that their survival depended on silence. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a veteran of the class since its troubled inception, patted the bulkhead of the missile compartment affectionately. He remembered the years of ridicule, the jokes about the tugboat hull and the guns with no bullets. He remembered the congressional hearings, the threats of cancellation, the feeling that they were serving on a white elephant. But tonight, seeing the terrified confusion of the Chinese fleet on the tactical displays, seeing the Halsey safe, he knew that the investment had paid off. They were the tip of the spear, the unseen blade that kept the dragon at bay. He checked the pressure readings on the hypersonic canisters, the numbers green and steady. They were ready. The world was a dangerous place, filled with red lines and angry men, but as long as the ghosts were patrolling the deep, there was a chance, just a chance, that the lines wouldn't turn into borders of blood. The moon rose over the Pacific, casting a silver path across the water that the Halsey followed toward safety. Thorne returned to the bridge, the coffee having settled his nerves, and looked out at the empty ocean behind them. The Zumwalt and Mansour were gone, completely invisible to the eye and radar, but he felt their presence like a phantom limb. He picked up the bridge log to make the entry for the watch, his pen hovering over the paper. How to record a miracle. He wrote simply, interdicted by hostile forces, assisted by friendly units, proceeding to station. It was a gross understatement, a bureaucratic lie that covered the terrifying truth of the night, but it was the Navy way, the story of the Red Line, and the stealth destroyers would be told in hushed tones in officers' clubs and mess decks for years to come, a legend of the night the sea ghosts saved the day. But for now, the only sound was the steady wash of the waves against the hull, a timeless rhythm that cared nothing for flags or borders, whispering the eternal truth that the sea keeps its secrets. Deep in the engineering spaces of the Zumwalt, the hum of the integrated power system was the heartbeat of the ship. Lieutenant Commander Aris Thorne, no relation to the captain of the Halsey, though they shared the name, monitored the power distribution grid. The ship was generating enough electricity to power a small city, channeling it into the propulsion drives and the massive capacitors for the sensors. The beauty of the Zumwalt wasn't just its stealth, it was its reserve. They had barely tapped into the ship's potential during the standoff. The hypersonic missiles were the current loadout, but the ship was designed for directed energy weapons, for lasers that could melt incoming missiles at the speed of light. Aris watched the energy flow indicators, mesmerizing bars of blue light, and smiled. They were just getting started. The encounter with the Nanchang was a proof of concept, a live fire test without the fire. They had proven that a ship could dominate a battlespace simply by existing within it unseen. The geopolitical fallout would be immediate and severe. In Washington, the president was already being briefed on the incident, the secure lines buzzing with the implications of the Chinese withdrawal. In Beijing, emergency meetings were being convened to analyze the sensor data from the Nanchang to try and pierce the veil of the American stealth technology. But out here, in the salt and the dark, politics felt distant. The reality was the proximity of death, the adrenaline of the near miss, and the camaraderie of the crew. On the mess deck of the Halsey, sailors were already spinning yarns, exaggerating the size of the Chinese fleet, the closeness of the missiles, the suddenness of the Zumwalt's arrival. "I swear I saw the water boil before it surfaced," one young seaman claimed, his eyes wide. "It didn't surface, you idiot. It was there the whole time," an older boatswain's mate corrected him, though he sounded unsure himself. "It's a ninja ship. That's what it is." The laughter that followed was brittle, the release of tension that could have easily been screams. Back on the Zumwalt, Captain Vance sat in her command chair, the bridge lights dimmed to a combat red. She checked the fuel status, the stores, the crew readiness. They could stay out here for weeks, a silent sentinel on the edge of the disputed zone. She knew that the Chinese would be back, that they would probe and test, and try to find a way to counter the stealth advantage. It was an eternal game of cat and mouse, and tonight the mouse had grown fangs. She looked at the tactical plot, at the vast emptiness of the Pacific, and felt a strange sense of peace. They were the guardians of the void, the keepers of the red line. "Ode," she said quietly. "Maintain surveillance posture. Let's see what tomorrow brings." "Aye, Captain," the officer of the deck replied, his face illuminated by the glow of the radar screen. The ship moved on, a shadow in the night, carrying the weight of a fragile piece on its angular shoulders, ready to disappear, ready to strike, ready to ensure that the red line remained a warning and not a finish line for humanity. The next morning, the sun rose over a peaceful ocean. The fishermen who plied the waters near the second Thomas Shoal saw nothing but the usual seabirds and the distant haze of the horizon. The great gray ship retreated to their respective corners of the geopolitical ring. But the water remembered. The electromagnetic spectrum remembered the spike of the targeting radars, the ghost signals of the stealth destroyers. The world had changed in the dark, shifted on its axis by the weight of unfired missiles. The red line was still there, invisible on the map, but burned into the minds of the men who had stared across it. And somewhere in the deep, running silent and deep, the Zumwalt waited, a dormant volcano of steel and circuitry, a promise that when the line was crossed again, the response would be swift, silent, and decisive. The age of the dreadnought was over. The age of the ghost had begun. In the weeks that followed, the intelligence communities of both nations went into overdrive. The Nanchang sensor logs were dissected frame by frame, every glitch and anomaly analyzed for clues to the Zumwalt's signature. The U.S. Navy, emboldened by the success, accelerated the refit of the third hull, the USS Lyndon B. Johnson, rushing to complete the triumvirate of stealth. The skirmish became a case study in naval colleges around the world, a textbook example of deterrence by denial. But for Captain Thorne of the Halsey, the lesson was more personal. He applied for a transfer to the Surface Development Squadron, the unit that commanded the Zumwalts. He wanted to be on the other side of the invisibility cloak. He wanted to be the one watching from the dark. The fear he had felt in the CIC, the absolute certainty of his own destruction, had changed him. He no longer wanted to be the shield. He wanted to be the dagger. The Halsey docked in Pearl Harbor 2 weeks later, her hull stained with salt, her crew exhausted but triumphant. They were greeted not with a parade, but with the quiet nods of fellow sailors who knew the score. They had stared down the dragon and lived to tell the tale. Thorne walked down the gangway, his sea bag over his shoulder, and looked back at his ship. She was a good ship, a brave ship, but she was a relic. He turned his gaze toward the dry docks where the future was being built, where the sharp angles of the next generation were taking shape. The red line had saved them this time, but next time, the line might not hold. The only guarantee of peace was the ability to win the war before it started. And as he walked toward his car, the tropical breeze rusting the palm trees, he couldn't shake the image of the Zumwalt rising from the electronic noise, a dark angel of the apocalypse that had brought not death, but a second chance at life. The script of the future was being written in stealth coding and hypersonic glide bodies, and Thorne intended to be one of the authors. The incident at the red line faded from the news cycle, replaced by domestic scandals and economic reports, but in the classified briefings of the Pentagon and the Politburo, it remained a burning coal. The Chinese accelerated their own stealth destroyer program, the Type 58, sparking a new arms race of invisibility. The ocean, once a vast commons, was becoming a crowded room where everyone was wearing a blindfold and holding a knife. But for now, the peace held. The trade routes remained open. The fishermen cast their nets. And deep in the blue, the Zumwalt-class patrolled, their crews living in a perpetual twilight of red screens and hushed voices, the silent guardians of a world that didn't know how close it had come to burning. The red line was a psychological construct, a bluff, a dare. But the Zumwalt was real. The hypersonics were real. And as long as they were out there, the red line was a wall of fire that no one dared to touch. The final log entry of the Zumwalt for that deployment read simply, "Patrol complete. No contact." It was the ultimate stealth victory, to be everywhere and nowhere, to win without fighting, to be the ghost that haunts the nightmares of the enemy. Captain Vance signed the log with a flourish, closed the book, and looked out at the lights of San Diego shimmering in the distance. They were home. But part of her, the part that had been forged in the cold tension of the South China Sea, was still out there, waiting, watching the red line, daring the world to cross it. The game had changed, the pieces had moved, and the checkmate was waiting in the silence. 1 month later, a leaked satellite photo appeared on a defense forum. It showed a grainy, overhead view of the South China Sea during the incident. Most of the ocean was black water, but in one corner, there was a faint, triangular wake, almost imperceptible against the waves. The caption read simply, "The day the Navy showed up." It was shared thousands of times, debated by armchair admirals and serious analysts alike. Some called it a fake, a Photoshop job. Others called it proof of secret alien technology. But those who knew, those who had been there, looked at the photo and felt a chill. It wasn't a ship in the picture, it was a warning. A warning that the rules of engagement had been rewritten, and that the next time the red line was crossed, the response wouldn't just a show of force. It would be a strike from the void. And in the silence of the deep, the Zumwalt slept, dreaming of the day it would wake up and scream. The legacy of the confrontation was a fragile, terrified stability. Diplomacy returned to the forefront, driven by the realization that the military option was no longer a predictable calculus of tonnage and tubes. The uncertainty introduced by the stealth destroyers forced to talk, to negotiate, to find face-saving exits from their escalating rhetoric. The Red Line incident, as it came to be known, was a paradox, a moment of extreme danger that ultimately secured the peace. It proved that, in the modern age, the most powerful weapon was not the one that made the biggest boom, but the one that created the biggest doubt. The Zumwalt, the ship that critics had called a failure, a waste of money, a boat without a mission, had found its purpose. It was the doubtbringer, the hesitation maker, the ghost in the machine of war. And as the years passed, and the rust formed on the Halsey and the Nanchang, the legend of the stealth destroyers grew, a modern myth of the sea that kept the monsters at bay. Ultimately, the story wasn't about the ships, or the missiles, or the red lines. It was about the people inside the machines, the fear and the courage, the decisions made in split seconds that determined the fate of nations. It was about Thorne holding his ground, jaw blinking, and Vance waiting in the dark. It was a human drama played out on a stage of steel and ocean, a testament to the enduring fact that even in an age of hypersonics and stealth, the most critical component of warfare is the mind of the commander. The red line was crossed, the Navy showed up, and the world held its breath. And when the exhale finally came, it sounded like the whisper of a ghost ship slipping back into the night, its job done, its presence fading like a bad dream, leaving behind only the calm, indifferent sea. Captain Vance stood on the pier in San Diego, the smell of eucalyptus and exhaust mixing with the salt air. She looked up at the angular, monolithic superstructure of her ship. It was ugly to some, beautiful to her. It was a survivor. It had survived the budget cuts, the technical failures, the ridicule. And now it had survived the red line. She patted composite hull, a gesture of affection and respect. "Rest well," she whispered. "We'll need you again." She turned and walked towards the parking lot, the keys to her car jingling in her pocket. The world was safe for another day. The red line was intact, and the ghosts were resting. But the ocean was vast, and history was a circle. The line would be crossed again, and when it was, the Zumwalt would be there, waiting, watching, ready, the silent guardian of the red line. The end.